Living with Alexander wasn't a marriage, it was a prison sentence. In that house, 6:45 a.m. was the law. If breakfast was 60 seconds late, I was met with a week of silence. No eye contact, no voice, just the cold weight of his disappointment pressing down on every room I walked into. He didn't want a husband. He wanted a clockwork doll he could wind up with his checkbook. I spent years shrinking myself just to fit into the corners of his life. Until I woke up. I don't know how I got into this body. I don't know what cosmic joke put me here, wearing another man's skin, carrying another man's regrets, but I know one thing with total, bone-deep clarity. I have 3 days before this divorce is final, and I am not spending a single second of them begging for his mercy. The old Julian would have been in the kitchen right now, trembling over a frying pan, praying the eggs were perfect, praying the toast wasn't a shade too dark, praying that today, just today, would be the day Alexander looked at him like a person instead of a possession that occasionally malfunctioned. But I sat on the edge of the bed, divorce papers spread across the duvet like a hand of cards I didn't ask to be dealt, and I didn't feel fear. I felt something colder. Sharper. Relief, maybe, or the beginning of it. Alexander thought he owned me because he signed the checks. He was about to find out that peace is the one thing his billions never bought him. Not once, not ever. I woke up to silence. Not the peaceful kind, not the kind that lets a person breathe. This was the manufactured silence of a house built to intimidate. 20-foot ceilings, marble that swallowed footsteps, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Manhattan like the city itself was just another asset in Alexander Cole's portfolio. My name is Julian Cole, technically, though I never got used to the sound of it, and the first thing I understood, lying there in a bed that felt more like a hospital cot than a marriage, was that I had inherited a nightmare mid-sentence. The second thing I understood was the clock. It sat on the nightstand, brass and merciless, and I knew, the way you know your own name, the way the body remembers things the mind hasn't caught up to yet, that it read 6:31 a.m. 14 minutes until the law took effect. 6:45, that was when breakfast appeared on the table downstairs, plated, garnished, exactly the way Alexander liked it, exactly on time every single day for the 3 years this body had lived that life before I arrived to take it over. I lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling, and I let the old Julian's memories wash over me like cold water. I saw the mornings, hundreds of them blurred together into one long gray corridor. Julian standing at the stove at 6:20, hands shaking slightly, checking the eggs, checking the clock, checking the eggs again. I saw him, saw myself, saw this borrowed body flinch at the sound of footsteps on the stairs, not because Alexander had ever raised a hand, but because he didn't need to. His silence was the weapon. His silence could fill a house for a week. I remembered the morning breakfast was 90 seconds late because the toaster jammed. Alexander walked into the kitchen, looked at the clock, looked at Julian, and said nothing. He picked up his coffee, made by the housekeeper, never trusted to Julian's hands, and left for the office without a word. Julian didn't see him again for 6 days. Not a text, not a call, just an empty side of the bed and a silence so total it had texture, like a fog you could reach out and touch. I felt the old Julian's shame like it was my own, because in some strange transmigrated way it was. The shrinking, the endless calibration of a life around one man's temperature, one man's mood, one man's clock. There was a memory that surfaced sharper than the rest, a night maybe 8 months into the marriage when Julian had asked, so quietly it was almost a whisper, if they could just have dinner together without the schedule. No rules, no timer, just 2 people eating a meal. Alexander had looked at him like he'd suggested burning the house down. "I am the one out there conquering the world to fund your leisure," he'd said, voice flat and precise, each word a blade. "You sit here crossing your legs and eating the food I pay for, and you have the audacity to complain about a schedule? If you want to be treated like an equal, start acting like one." I felt that memory land in my chest like a stone, because I understood, in that instant, exactly what kind of prison I'd woken up in. Not bars, not locks, Something worse, a cage built entirely out of someone else's conditions for love, conditions that shifted just enough that you could never quite meet them, never quite rest. There was another memory, one the old Julian had buried so deep I almost missed it, surfacing now only because I was no longer afraid enough to keep it down. A dinner party, maybe a year into the marriage. Important people, important names, the kind of night Alexander rehearsed for like a Broadway opening. Julian had said something at the table, some small observation about the wine, meant to be charming. Alexander hadn't corrected him in front of the guests. He'd waited. He'd waited 3 days. 3 days of silence so complete that Julian started talking to the housekeeper just to remember what his own voice sounded like. And when Alexander finally spoke again, it wasn't an apology, and it wasn't even really about the wine. It was a single sentence, delivered without heat, without even the courtesy of anger. "Know your place, and I'll never have to remind you of it again." I felt that sentence settle into me like a hook set deep in soft tissue. Know your place? As if a marriage were a hierarchy with a single seat at the top, and every other seat in the house existed only to reflect his light back at him. I understood, lying there with the clock ticking towards 6:38, that the old Julian hadn't just been afraid of Alexander's silence, he'd been trained by it, the way you train an animal, not with cruelty exactly, nothing so honest as cruelty, but with the slow, patient application of conditional warmth. Be perfect, and you'll be tolerated. Be late, and you'll be erased. There was no cruelty a person could point to in a court of law, just an absence repeated until it became architecture. I thought about the version of Julian who had lived inside that house for 3 years, learning its load-bearing walls, learning exactly how much space he was allowed to take up before the ceiling came down. I thought about how much of a person you have to sand away to fit inside a house like that. I wasn't going to sand anything else away. Whatever was left of me, however much of me a transmigrated soul actually gets to keep, I intended to spend all of it standing at my full height. The clock ticked to 6:38. 7 minutes. I sat up, and for the first time since I'd opened my eyes in this life, I smiled. Because I wasn't the old Julian. I didn't carry his 3 years of flinching. I carried his memories, yes. I had access to every humiliation, every silence, every rule, but I didn't carry his fear. Fear needs time to root. Mine hadn't had the chance. I looked at the divorce papers on the nightstand. Alexander's lawyer had drawn them up 2 weeks ago, cold and clinical, the final formality after years of a marriage that had already ended in every way that mattered. The old Julian had been too afraid to sign them, too afraid of a life without the gilded cage, even one this suffocating. I picked up the pen sitting beside them. I didn't sign. Not yet. 3 days, I reminded myself. Let him watch the clock stop mattering. Let him watch the doll grow a spine. I got dressed. I did not go to the kitchen. At 6:47, 2 minutes past the law, I heard his footsteps on the stairs, measured, unhurried, a man who had never once questioned that the world would arrange itself around his schedule. I heard him reach the bottom step. I heard the silence that followed, the silence where breakfast should have been, and even from the bedroom, I could feel the temperature in the house drop. Old Julian would have been in a full panic by now. I just tied my shoes. This was the prison I had inherited, a mansion with marble floors and a man in it who mistook control for love, obedience for partnership, and silence for a fair punishment. I understood, sitting there, lacing up boots that weren't mine in a life that wasn't mine, that I didn't need to burn the house down. I just needed to walk out of it. 3 days. I had 3 days to remind this house and the man who ruled it that a person is not an asset wound up by a checkbook. I stood up, walked to the door, and for the first time in this borrowed life, I didn't check the clock on my way out. I came downstairs at 7:15 in a robe, hair a mess, coffee already brewing in my hand from the little machine in the guest kitchen Alexander never used. 30 minutes past the law, an eternity by the house's standards. He was standing in the dining room like a statue commissioned to represent disappointment, watch in hand, eyes on the door before I'd even fully entered it. "It's 7:15, he said, each word clipped, controlled, the voice of a man used to being obeyed before he finished a sentence. "Where is my breakfast? I'm out there making ends meet so you can cross your legs and eat my food, and you can't even tell time?" I took a sip of coffee, let the silence sit there a beat longer than was comfortable. For him, not for me. "Then use some of that money to hire a chef, Alexander. I'm not a kitchen appliance." I turned toward the front hall, robe still on, coffee still in hand. "I'm going for a walk." I watched something crack behind his eyes. Not anger, he was too disciplined for anger. Something closer to disbelief. The particular disbelief of a man who has never once in his entire adult life heard the word no directed at him with that kind of calm. I didn't wait to see what he did with it. I walked out into a September morning that smelled like actual air instead of imported orchids, and for the first time since I'd woken up in this life, I breathed all the way down to the bottom of my lungs. The old Julian's memories told me this was the moment everything would usually collapse, the moment fear would flood back in, the moment he'd turn around and go make the eggs anyway, apologizing with his hands because he'd run out of ways to apologize with his mouth. I kept walking. He tried the only weapon he had left. By the time I got back to the house that evening, my cards were dead. All 3 of them declined in a humiliating little chorus at 3 different registers before I gave up and paid cash for a sandwich, laughing under my breath the entire walk home. He was waiting when I got in, arms crossed, standing in the foyer like a man guarding a vault. "Come back when you're ready to follow my rules," he said. I didn't answer right away. I walked past him to the bedroom, opened the drawer where the old Julian kept his jewelry Alexander had given him the way you'd toss a bone to a well-behaved dog, and pulled out the diamond watch, the one Alexander had presented 18 months ago after a particularly brutal week of silence, calling it a reward for not embarrassing him in front of the board. I held it up so Alexander could see it catch the light. "You gave me this as a reward for being quiet," I said. "I'm going to use it to buy my voice." I slid it into my pocket. "Keep your cards, Alexander. I'm done being your employee." I sold the watch the next morning to a discreet dealer 2 blocks from a design studio I'd walked past 100 times in the old Julian's memories and never once had the courage to enter. $11,000, cash and wire combined. Not a fortune, but it was mine, earned by nothing except the decision to stop being owned. I felt Alexander's panic before I understood it. He'd expected me to crawling back within a day, handout, apology loaded and ready. When 7 p.m. came and went that evening, and I wasn't standing at the door to take his coat, a ritual so ingrained in this house that its absence felt like an alarm going off, I watched, from the top of the stairs, the exact moment he realized his power had never come from his money. It had come from my submission, and I had just taken it back. I spent that second night in the guest room, not out of any remaining deference to the marriage, but because I wanted the distance, one more wall between me and the sound of him pacing downstairs, phone in hand, calling people he trusted to fix problems he'd never once had to fix himself. I could hear the low murmur of his voice through the floorboards, sharp and controlled even in crisis, the voice of a man used to solving everything by applying enough pressure in the right direction. There was no pressure he could apply to this. That was the part I don't think he understood yet, lying awake down there running numbers on a problem that had never been about numbers. I lay in the guest bed and let myself think, for the first time without flinching, about what came next. $11,000 wasn't freedom. It was a down payment on freedom, a single brick in a foundation I'd have to lay myself, one interview and one paycheck at a time. The old Julian's memories supplied a quiet, persistent dread about that. 3 years of being told in 100 small ways that he wasn't capable of surviving outside the structure Alexander had built around him. I let the dread arrive. I just didn't let it stay. Because underneath it was something the old Julian had never quite gotten to feel, the specific, electric relief of a decision that was entirely, unambiguously mine. Not negotiated, not permitted, mine. I fell asleep somewhere past 2, and for the first time since I'd woken up in this borrowed life, I didn't dream about clocks. I didn't wait for him to dismiss me this time. I stood at the front door at 7 p.m. sharp, the law zone hour, weaponized back at him, with one suitcase at my feet and the signed papers in my hand. He came down the stairs slowly, like a man walking toward a verdict he already knew. "You'll be back in a week," he said, and for the first time his voice wasn't clipped, it wavered, just slightly, right at the edge. "You have nothing without me." I held up the papers. "I've signed. No alimony, no assets, just my freedom." I looked at him, really looked, maybe for the first time since I'd woken up in this life, at the man behind the schedule and the silence, and I felt nothing sharp enough to call hatred. Just a clean, quiet distance. "You said I should act like an equal. This is me acting like your superior. Goodbye, Alexander. You'll be back in a week. You have nothing." I picked up my suitcase. "I have myself," I said. "That's more than you've ever had." I walked out. I didn't look back, not because I was performing strength for an audience of one, but because I genuinely didn't need to. The house behind me had never been a home. It had been a very expensive holding cell with excellent lighting. I didn't need a settlement. I needed the sun. And for the first time in 3 years, I was finally standing in it. The design firm was called Halverson & Cole Creative. No relation. A coincidence that made me laugh out loud the first time I saw it on the building directory, like the universe had a sense of humor about which Coles got to matter in my life now. It was a world away from Alexander's mansion in every way that counted. The office took up 4 floors of a converted warehouse in the meatpacking district, exposed brick and steel beams, and a low, constant hum of music someone always had playing from the far end of the floor. People talked over each other in meetings, people laughed. Someone's dog wandered the halls on Fridays. I got the job 3 weeks after the divorce, hired as a junior designer on the strength of a portfolio the old Julian had built in secret, late at night, in the years before Alexander convinced him a career was an unnecessary distraction from his real job of running the house. My first day, my desk mate, a sharp-tongued, endlessly kind man named Leo, took one look at my sketches and said, "Okay, who taught you negative space, and can I steal them for the agency?" I didn't tell him I'd taught myself, in stolen hours, hiding a life I actually wanted inside a marriage that had no room for it. For the first time in 3 years, my ideas mattered. People asked my opinion, and then actually waited for the answer. It was such a small thing, and it undid something in my chest every single time it happened. But there was one thing everyone in that office whispered about, in the particular hushed tone reserved for weather systems and gods. Silas. I heard the name before I ever saw the man attached to it. Silas Whitfield, the big boss, the one who owned not just this branch but 11 others scattered across the country. A name spoken like a title rather than an identity. He was, by every account, the kind of CEO who existed mostly in quarterly reports and rare high-stakes briefings. 3 visits a month tops. Powerful, distant, incredibly busy. A myth with a corner office he almost never used. At least, he had been. "Julian," Leo said one afternoon, leaning over my desk with the particular energy of a man who has been sitting on gossip for exactly as long as he could stand it. "Something is up. Silas hasn't missed a day in 2 weeks. He's here at 8. He doesn't leave till the last light's out. The rumor mill says he's looking for something." A pause, eyebrows climbing, or someone. I kept my eyes on my blueprints, doing my best impression of a man who found this only mildly interesting. I'd met Silas exactly once, my second week, when he'd walked the floor during a project review and stopped, just for a moment, just long enough to look at the concept boards pinned above my desk. He hadn't said much, just "this one," tapping a sketch I'd almost thrown out. "Build the whole campaign around this one." Then he was gone, back into his glass office, and the floor had exhaled like it had been holding its breath the entire time. There was something about him that didn't match the mythology. The mythology said cold. What I'd felt, standing 3 feet from him, was precise, a very different thing. Alexander's coldness had always felt like punishment. Silas's stillness felt like attention. I told myself it didn't matter. I had spent 3 years being someone's carefully managed asset. I wasn't in a hurry to hand myself over to a new set of expectations, even ones wrapped in a nicer voice. But he kept showing up anyway. Late one Thursday, deep into a deadline, I looked up from my desk to find a cup of coffee sitting beside my keyboard. My order exactly. Oat milk, 1 pump of vanilla, the specific, slightly ridiculous combination the old Julian had never once dared order in front of Alexander, who thought custom coffee orders were an affectation for people without real problems. Alexander had never known I liked it. Silas hadn't asked. He'd simply noticed, apparently, over the low hum of a dozen conversations I never thought anyone was actually listening to. When I looked up, he was already 3 steps away, heading back toward his glass office, and he gave me nothing more than a single brief nod before he turned the corner. The floor went into a silent frenzy the second he was out of sight. "Did that just happen?" Leo said, not really a question. "It's just coffee," I said, and went back to my blueprints, and did not think about it for the rest of the day, which is to say I thought about almost nothing else. It kept happening. Small things. A note in the margin of a project brief. Good instinct, trust it. In handwriting too careful to be careless. A meeting rescheduled, quietly, when he noticed I'd been up 2 nights straight on a deadline. Once, when I missed a status update because I'd lost track of time sketching, I felt the old panic rise in my throat, fast and familiar, the specific dread the old Julian's body still remembered from 3 years of being late. I found Silas in the hallway outside the meeting room, prepared for, I didn't even know what, a version of Alexander's silence, a colder version of disappointment. Instead, he just looked at me, unbothered, and said, "It's just a meeting, Julian. Your talent is worth the wait." A pause, his eyes doing something quieter, something that felt less like assessment and more like actual concern. "Are you okay?" I didn't have an answer ready. Nobody had ever asked me that question and meant it as a real question, waiting for a real answer, instead of a formality to get through before the real business started. "I'm fine," I said, which wasn't quite a lie and wasn't quite the truth either. He didn't push. He just nodded, like my answer, whatever its honesty level, was something he respected enough not to interrogate, and went back to his office. I stood in that hallway a long moment, feeling something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not the electric panic of the mansion, something slower, warmer, something I didn't yet have a name for, and wasn't in any hurry to name, because naming it felt like the first step toward wanting it, and wanting things from other people had cost the old Julian everything once. Still, I noticed the scent of that office more than I noticed almost anything those weeks, the particular mix of fresh paper and steel, and, faintly, cedar. Nothing like the sterile, orchid-scented emptiness of Alexander's mansion, where every room smelled like a hotel no one actually lived in. I noticed the sound of Silas's voice, low and even, never once raised, carrying an authority that didn't need volume to land. Alexander's commands had always been sharp, designed to cut. Silas's words felt more like a hand held steady under something that might otherwise fall. I told myself, again, that it didn't matter. I was starting to understand that I was lying to myself and getting worse at believing it every single day. There was a night, maybe 5 weeks into the job, when I stayed past 10 to finish a pitch deck nobody had actually asked me to perfect. The floor had emptied out hours earlier. Leo gone, the cleaning crew gone, even the ambient speaker finally silent for once. I liked the quiet of an empty office. It was nothing like the quiet of the mansion. This quiet had no teeth. I didn't hear Silas approach. I felt it. The specific shift in air pressure a room makes when someone enters it who isn't trying to be noticed and is noticed anyway. He was in shirt sleeves, tie loosened, a look I hadn't seen on him before that made him seem, for the first time, less like a myth and more like a man who'd simply had a long day. "You're still here," he said. Not a question, Not a reprimand either, which was the part that unsettled me most because every instinct the old Julian's body still carried braced for the second half of that sentence. The why, the accusation, the silent countdown starting somewhere behind his eyes. It never came. "Pitch deck," I said, gesturing at the mess of layouts spread across 2 monitors. "It wasn't due until Friday, I just wanted it right." He walked over, slow, unhurried, and looked at the screen for a long moment. "You could have gone home at 6 and it still would have been right." "I know." I didn't look up. "I like it here better than home some nights." I hadn't meant to say that. It slipped out sideways, the kind of honesty that only escapes a person when they're tired enough to stop guarding the door. I braced for it to land wrong, for him to ask a follow-up question I wasn't ready to answer, for the moment to tip into something that demanded more of me than I had left to give that night. Instead, he pulled the chair from the empty desk beside mine, turned it around, and sat, forearms resting on the back of it, watching the screen instead of me, which somehow made it easier to keep talking. "Then, stay as long as you need," he said. "I'll lock up." We didn't talk about anything important after that. He asked about the typeface I'd chosen and disagreed with my kerning, gently, the way you'd needle a friend instead of correct a subordinate. I found myself laughing, actually laughing, unguarded, the sound surprising me almost as much as it seemed to surprise him, at some small, dry joke about his own terrible taste in fonts. It was nearly midnight when I finally packed up. He walked me to the elevator, said goodnight, and didn't linger, didn't make it into more than it was. But I stood in that elevator afterward, riding down through 11 floors of a building that had never once made me feel small, and I understood something I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. I hadn't stayed late for the pitch deck, not really. Some quieter, more honest part of me had been hoping, without quite admitting it, that he'd stay too. The office noticed before I was ready for them to notice. It started small, Leo accidentally walking past Silas's glass office 4 times in one afternoon, each time slowing down just enough to peer in and confirm nothing had changed since the last pass. Then it spread. By the end of that week, I was fairly sure half the design floor had developed an entire private mythology around me and Silas, one I was catching only in fragments. A hushed conversation that stopped the second I walked into the break room, a group of junior designers who suddenly found their shoes fascinating when I caught them staring. "You know, everyone thinks you two are secretly dating," Leo said one lunch, with the particular bluntness of a man who considers subtlety a waste of good gossip. I nearly choked on my coffee. "We are not dating." Sure. He held up both hands, entirely unconvinced. "It's just, and I say this with love, Silas Whitfield has personally rescheduled 3 board calls this month around your project timeline." Board calls, Julian. The man doesn't reschedule board calls for the branch presidents. That's just good management. That's a man building his entire week around seeing you at your desk, and you know it. Leo leaned back, grinning like he'd won an argument I hadn't agreed to have. "I give it 3 more weeks before he does something about it. My money's on him finding some flimsy business reason to keep you late at the office." I didn't dignify that with a response, mostly because some traitorous part of me had already started keeping a mental tally of exactly how many times Silas had, in fact, found a flimsy business reason to keep me late at the office. It was a higher number than I was comfortable admitting to Leo, or to myself, standing there with my coffee going lukewarm in my hand. What I didn't tell Leo, what I could barely admit to the version of myself lying awake at night in the small, unremarkable apartment I'd found with the last of the watch money, was how strange it felt to be gossiped about like that. Not whispered about the way the old Julian had once imagined the staff whispered about him in Alexander's house, pity dressed up as concern. This was different. This was warm. This was an entire office rooting for something good to happen to me without asking anything of me in return for their affection. I hadn't known that kind of attention could exist without a price tag attached. I told myself, walking back to my desk that afternoon, that it still didn't mean anything. I told myself that for 3 more days, right up until the morning Silas left a second cup of coffee on my desk beside the first one, still untouched, and said, without any particular emphasis, "In case the first one wasn't enough today." Then he walked away before I could figure out whether that sentence was about the coffee at all. It probably wasn't. I was at the cafe 2 blocks from the office, laughing, actually laughing, head back, coffee nearly spilling, at something Leo had said about our creative director's disastrous attempt at a TikTok trend. We were celebrating a project launch, the good, loud, easy kind of celebrating that the old Julian had never once been allowed inside a marriage built on schedules and silence. I felt the temperature of the room change before I saw him. Alexander stood at the edge of our table like he'd wandered in from a different, colder universe. He looked at me, really looked, the way you look at something you can't reconcile with your memory of it. And for a second, I watched confusion war with recognition across his face. Julian? His voice cracked slightly on the name. What is this? Who is this man? Alexander, I said, calm, unhurried. This is Leo, my colleague. We're celebrating a project launch. I glanced at Leo, whose eyebrows had climbed somewhere near his hairline. Leo, this is someone I used to know. Used to know? Something flared behind Alexander's eyes, old authority reaching for a grip that no longer existed. I was your husband. I paid for a ghost, I said, and I didn't raise my voice, because I didn't need to. 3 years of silence had taught me that stillness could cut deeper than shouting ever could. I'm eating my own food now, Alexander, and it tastes a lot better than yours. He opened his mouth. Whatever he'd planned to say next, he seemed to think better of it. In front of an audience he no longer had any power over. He looked at Leo, really looked, the way a man looks when he's trying to catalog a threat, and found nothing there worth his time either. Just a stranger with kind eyes and a half-eaten croissant, entirely unbothered by whatever performance Alexander had walked in expecting to give. This isn't over, he said finally, which is the thing men like Alexander say when it very much is over, and they simply haven't caught up to the fact yet. It's been over for a while. You just weren't in the room for it. He left. No dramatic exit, no slammed door, just a man walking back out onto the sidewalk with considerably less certainty than he'd walked in with. Phone already halfway out of his pocket, already reaching for some assistant or lawyer or board member who could hand him back a sense of control he could no longer locate on his own. I stood there a second longer than I needed to, watching the door swing shut behind him, and I felt something settle in my chest that had nothing to do with triumph. It was quieter than that, steadier. The particular, unglamorous relief of discovering that a fear you'd carried for years simply didn't have teeth anymore. Leo let out a low whistle. Okay, I have several questions. Later, I said, laughing despite myself, and we finished our coffee, and for the rest of that afternoon I didn't think about Alexander at all, which was, I was starting to understand, its own kind of victory. I should have known it wasn't the last of him. Men like Alexander don't retreat, they regroup. He came back 6 days later, and this time he didn't bother with cafes or ambushes dressed up as coincidence. He came straight to the office. I heard the commotion before I understood what it was. Raised voices near reception, the particular tension of a lobby full of people trying very hard to look like they weren't listening. By the time I made it to the front, Alexander was standing at the security desk, tie immaculate, voice pitched at the exact volume calibrated to sound reasonable to a stranger while still being a threat to everyone who actually knew him. I need to see my husband, he was saying, to a receptionist who very clearly wanted to be anywhere else on earth. Julian Cole. Tell him Alexander is here. It's just Julian now, I said, stepping into the lobby before I'd fully decided to. Not Julian Cole. I dropped the name along with everything else. His head snapped toward me, and for a moment I watched him recalculate the entire approach, the way you'd watch someone realize the ground under them had shifted mid-step. Julian, we need to talk. In private. We don't, actually. I kept my voice level, kept it in that same register I'd found at the cafe. Not performing calm, just genuinely occupying it, the way you occupy a room that finally belongs to you. You embarrassed me, he said, and there it was, the real reason, finally, stripped of the flowers and the wounded husband routine. Not love, Never love. Just the unbearable novel sensation of being made small in front of people whose respect he'd assumed was permanent. In front of your little friends. Do you have any idea what that cost me? I have some idea. About the same as what 3 years of silence cost me, probably. Funny how that math works out. Something in his face cracked, not softened, cracked. The particular fracture of a man watching his own reflection say something he'd never once let himself hear out loud. For a second, just a second, I almost felt something like pity for him. Almost. "You don't get to walk in here and demand an audience, Alexander," I said, quieter now because the anger had already burned through and what was left underneath it was just tired, unshakable clarity. "You don't get to treat my job the way you treated our marriage, like something you can schedule around your convenience. I have work to do, real work, with people who actually see me doing it." The whole lobby had gone very still, the kind of stillness that happens when a room realizes it's witnessing something it wasn't supposed to see. I didn't look around to check who was watching. I didn't need an audience to say what I meant. I'd needed one, once, back when I was still afraid enough to require witnesses for my own courage. Not anymore. "Julian," Silas's voice from the top of the stairs behind me, low and even and utterly unbothered, the kind of calm that didn't need to announce itself as power because it simply was power, worn as easily as a second skin. He came down slowly, unhurried, and I understood, watching him cross the lobby floor, that he'd likely been standing there longer than I realized, letting me finish what I'd started before he ever stepped in. He didn't even look at Alexander at first. His eyes found mine, and something in his expression eased just slightly, checking without asking. Then, and only then, his gaze slid to Alexander, and I watched a man who had spent his entire life being the most powerful presence in every room he entered discover in real time what it felt like to be the second most powerful person in his own confrontation. Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to shout, didn't need a single dramatic gesture. He simply stood there, and the air around him rearranged itself the way it always did. And Alexander, who once froze an entire household with nothing but a look, took an involuntary half-step back. "Julian," Silas said, again, voice like velvet laid over steel, "the team is waiting for your input on the new project, shall we?" He didn't acknowledge Alexander at all, not a glance, not a word. The dismissal was so complete it felt almost merciful, the way ignoring a threat entirely can be crueler than confronting it. And I understood, standing there between the two of them, that Silas hadn't come down those stairs to rescue me. I hadn't needed rescuing. He'd come down because he wanted to stand beside me for the part that came after, the way you show up for someone not because they can't handle something alone, but because you don't want them to have to. I looked at Alexander one last time, not with hatred, not even really with anger anymore, but with something closer to distance. The specific piece of a person looking at a photograph of a life they no longer recognize as their own. "Goodbye, Alexander," I said. He stood there, in the lobby, security guard hovering at a careful distance, clutching whatever was left of his composure like it was the last asset in a portfolio going rapidly to zero. Standing in the shadow of a man who'd never once needed rules or schedules or a checkbook to command a room, only presence and something that, I was beginning to understand, might actually be respect. I didn't watch his face as I turned to leave, but I felt it anyway. The specific, silent unraveling of a man discovering in real time that the thing he'd spent years training to be quiet had simply learned a different language somewhere without him. Alexander had built his entire identity on being the loudest, most consequential presence in every room he entered. He'd never had to reckon with what happens when a room simply stops needing him in order to feel complete. I imagine if I'd turned around, I would have seen him standing there a long moment after we'd gone, phone buzzing in his pocket with some assistant or board member needing a decision only he could make, the machinery of his empire running exactly as smoothly as it always had, and none of it touching the one thing he'd actually come there to fix. There's a particular kind of grief reserved for people like Alexander. Not grief for a person lost exactly, but grief for a version of control that used to work and suddenly doesn't. The quiet, private devastation of realizing that the thing you built your whole life around was never actually love, no matter how much you'd convinced yourself it counted as some acceptable substitute. I didn't feel triumphant about it too. I want to be honest about that too. I felt something closer to a held breath finally let go. Not victory, just release, the specific relief of setting down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it wasn't part of my own body. I walked out of the lobby beside Silas toward the elevator bank, and I felt, for the first time in this entire borrowed life, like the center of someone's world instead of a fixture in someone else's house. Leo caught up to us at the elevator bank, having apparently watched the entire second act unfold from behind a very unconvincing potted plant. Okay, I need everyone to understand that I have now personally witnessed you out-CEO a CEO twice in 1 week. That was, Julian, that was a masterclass, both times. Something like that, I said. Leo looked between me and Silas, doing the math with the subtlety of a man doing absolutely no math at all. Right, he said slowly. Right, okay. I'm going to be normal about this at my own desk now. He peeled off toward the stairwell, throwing one last look over his shoulder that was less subtle than a foghorn. Silas didn't acknowledge the look. He just glanced at me, something warm and slightly amused moving behind his usual stillness. He's not wrong, you know, about the masterclass, either time. You didn't even raise your voice, either time. I didn't need to. The elevator arrived and he held the door for me, the small, ordinary courtesy of it landing heavier than it should have, given everything the old Julian's memory told me about doors, about who opened them, who was expected to wait for whom, and who counted as worth the 2 extra seconds of consideration. People like Alexander only understand 2 things: money and the absence of it. I don't need either to make a point. You didn't even need to say anything the second time, I said, stepping into the elevator beside him. I'd already said it. I noticed. The doors slid shut, and in the sudden quiet of the elevator car, his voice softened into something less like a CEO's and more like a man's. You didn't need me down there, Julian. I want you to know I know that. Then why'd you come? Because watching you do it alone was the single most impressive thing I've seen all year, and I wasn't about to miss the ending. And I love you, just so you know. I stepped through the doors when they opened, and for just a moment, standing that close to him in the frame of it, I let myself notice, really notice, the particular quiet confidence of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be heard, and who'd shown up anyway, not to fight my battle for me, but simply because he didn't want to be anywhere else. And I love him too. We rode up the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different silence than any I'd known before. Not the punishing, engineered silence of the mansion, but something almost companionable. Something that didn't demand I fill it with an apology. Alexander had built a marriage out of conditions, a schedule to meet, a silence to survive, a debt of gratitude I was somehow always behind on paying. Silas had built nothing. He'd simply shown up, consistently, without asking for anything in return except the small, ordinary dignity of being noticed. There were no rules here, no clock ticking on the nightstand counting down to a punishment I couldn't predict. Just the quiet, radical fact of someone choosing to be present, day after day, with nothing to gain from it except my company. That evening, back at my desk, Silas stopped by one last time. Not with coffee this time, just himself, leaning briefly against the frame of my cubicle like he had nowhere more important to be. For what it's worth, he said, I wasn't checking on the branch these last 2 weeks. I looked up. I know. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across his face, the first unguarded thing I'd seen from him since we'd met. Good, he said. Then I don't have to pretend anymore. He left it there. No demand, no countdown, no conditions attached to the moment waiting to be met or missed. I sat at my desk a long while after he'd gone, blueprints forgotten, listening to the ordinary hum of an office full of people who had never once made me feel like a ghost in my own life. My life didn't start the moment Silas walked into it. I want to be honest about that even now. It started 3 days before a divorce on a morning I chose not to make breakfast. It started with a sold watch and a suitcase, and a door I walked through without looking back. But it kept going every day after, because for the first time I had people around me who let it. No clocks, no prison, just me, finally, fully, unapologetically becoming the person I was always supposed to be in a life that had finally made room for him. I thought, walking out of that office into a city I no longer had to time myself against, about the version of Julian who'd woken up 3 years into a marriage he'd been too afraid to leave. I hoped, in whatever quiet way a transmigrated soul is allowed to hope for the body it borrowed, that some part of him, some folded-away, dormant part, could feel this. Could feel a door held open for no reason except courtesy. Could feel a room go warm instead of cold when someone important walked into it. I didn't know how long I'd stay in this life, or this body, or this strange, unearned second chance at a story that wasn't originally mine to finish, but I knew I wasn't going to spend whatever time I had left checking a clock on a nightstand waiting to find out if I'd been enough. I was already enough. I had been enough the whole time. It had just taken a divorce, a sold watch, and a man who never once needed to raise his voice to prove it. The end.